The colonel didn't see a Marine. He saw a problem stuffed into a perfectly tailored uniform. He saw a name on a heavily redacted file, Sergeant Anya Sharma, and a political headache he didn't ask for. They told him she was an asset, a new liaison for an experimental inter-unit program. He saw a woman of medium height and slender build, with dark, unreadable eyes and a stillness that was more disconcerting than any swagger. In a world of loud noises and aggressive postures, her silence was a foreign language. Her arrival at the barracks of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, was just as quiet and just as disruptive. She swung her sea bag from her shoulder with an economy of motion that was almost unnervingly fluid, her boots making no sound on the dusty concrete. On the porch, a fire team of young Marines, coiled springs of testosterone and bravado, stopped their banter. Corporal Miller, their self-appointed alpha, watched her approach, a smirk playing on his lips. He and his crew, PFCs Davis and Sanchez, were the gatekeepers of the unit's unforgiving culture. They saw her frame, not the steel wiring beneath the skin. They saw a box-ticking exercise, not a warrior. Sharma gave them a single, sweeping glance. It wasn't a challenge, it was an assessment. In that brief second, she cataloged them. Miller's insecurity masked by aggression, Davis's follower mentality, Sanchez's nervous energy. She registered the way they postured, the subtle shift in their weight, the way their eyes darted to each other for validation. It was data, nothing more. She didn't offer a greeting, knowing none would be genuinely returned. Instead, she moved past them toward the barracks entrance. "Lost, Sergeant," Miller called out, his voice dripping with condescending sweetness. Sharma stopped, but didn't turn. "I don't get lost, Corporal." Her voice was low and steady, carrying no inflection of anger or annoyance. It was a simple statement of fact, and its placid certainty seemed to rattle them more than any retort would have. She continued inside, the screen door whispering shut behind her, leaving them in a cloud of their own baffled machismo. She found her assigned rack, stowed her gear with geometric precision, and began a silent, methodical inventory of her new, temporary home. Every item in her kit was placed for maximum efficiency, a habit forged in environments where a misplaced magazine or a fumbled tool could be the difference between breathing and not. The other Marines watched her from the corners of their eyes, whispering. They didn't see discipline. They saw obsessive strangeness. They saw a puzzle that didn't fit their picture of the Corps, and they decided, in their silent, collective judgment, that the puzzle piece must be flawed. Sharma felt their eyes on her, a familiar pressure she had learned to use as a whetstone, sharpening her focus until the world narrowed to the mission in front of her. And right now, the mission was simply to exist in this space, to breathe their air, and await. Colonel Madsen's office was a shrine to the old Corps. Framed photographs of grim-faced men in bygone uniforms stared down from the walls, a pantheon of leatherneck gods. The air smelled of floor wax, old paper, and stale coffee. Madsen sat behind a large oak desk, a man carved from the same granite as the institution he served. He held Sharma's file in his hands, though he wasn't really reading it. The most important pages were missing, replaced by black bars of redaction. "Sergeant Sharma," he said, his voice a low gravel. He didn't invite her to sit. "Your file is thin." "It's complete as ordered, sir," Sharma replied, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall, just over his shoulder. She stood at a perfect position of attention, her body a rigid line of discipline. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, the battalion's senior enlisted Marine, stood off to the side, his face an impassive mask. He was a veteran of a dozen deployments, a man whose respect was the coin of the realm in this battalion. His silence was its own form of judgment, a wait-and-see approach that was far more unnerving than the colonel's open skepticism. "It tells me you're qualified in rifle, pistol, and a handful of other basic competencies," Madsen continued, tapping the thin folder. "It doesn't tell me a damn thing about why command thinks you're suited for integration with a line infantry unit. We're a tip-of-the-spear unit, Sergeant. We aren't a testing ground for new ideas. The dismissal was clear. He saw her as an experiment, a variable in an equation he had long ago solved. He believed in a specific type of Marine, big, loud, and aggressive. Sharma was none of those things. "I'm here to support the battalion's mission, Colonel. Your support isn't required. What is required is cohesion. A unit is a machine. Every part has to fit. It has to have been forged in the same fire. You understand?" "I understand metallurgy, sir," she said, the words flat and devoid of sarcasm. Yet they hung in the air with a strange weight. A flicker of annoyance crossed Madsen's face. He wanted a reaction, deference, frustration, anything but this unnerving calm. "Your last posting is completely blacked out. For all I know, you spent the last 3 years sharpening pencils at the Pentagon." "I'm proficient with a pencil, sir," she said. "And with a knife." Gunny Reyes shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of interest he had shown. Madsen stared at her, trying to find a crack in her composure. He found none. She was a stone wall, and he was throwing pebbles at it. "You'll be assigned to 1st Platoon, Bravo Company," he said finally, his tone making it sound like a punishment. "Gunny Reyes will get you situated. We have a full training schedule ahead of a deployment. Don't fall behind. I don't have the time or the inclination to run a remedial program." "I won't fall behind, sir," Sharma said. Dismissed. She executed a crisp about-face and walked out of the office. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving the 2 senior Marines in silence. Madsen tossed the file onto his desk. "What the hell am I supposed to do with that, Gunny?" Gunny Reyes finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I don't know, sir, but I have a feeling we're going to find out." He looked at the file, then at the door where she had disappeared. He'd seen a lot of Marines in his 22 years. He'd seen braggarts and cowards, heroes and fools. He wasn't sure what he had just seen in Sergeant Sharma, but it didn't feel like a problem. It felt like a trigger, waiting for a squeeze. In the days that followed, Anya Sharma became a ghost in the machine of Bravo Company. She existed on the periphery, a silent observer in a world of constant noise. She rose before the platoon, was in formation 5 minutes before the first note of reveille, and was the last to leave the armory, her weapon cleaned to a state of clinical perfection. She spoke only when spoken to, her answers brief, precise, and devoid of personal opinion. Her invisibility was a weapon she had honed over years in places where being noticed meant being killed. She watched. From her rack, she observed the social architecture of the platoon. She saw how Miller's fire team operated as a unit within the unit, their loyalty to him stronger than their loyalty to their squad leader. They moved with a swagger born of shared ignorance, their confidence a fragile shell. She saw the others, the quieter Marines who kept their heads down, doing the work without the fanfare, their competence overlooked in the shadow of Miller's bluster. On the range, she was a study in stillness. While other Marines fidgeted, adjusting their slings and cracking jokes, Sharma assumed her firing position and became part of the earth. Her breathing was a slow, controlled tide. Squeeze, bang, release. Her shot groupings were tight, consistently in the black, but never so perfect as to draw undue attention. It was controlled, measured excellence. Miller, whose own marksmanship was respectable but erratic, would glance over, a frown creasing his brow. Her consistency unnerved him. It felt unnatural. During physical training, she was relentless. She wasn't the fastest sprinter or the strongest lifter, but her endurance was inhuman. On long runs, as others started to labor, their form breaking down, Sharma's pace remained utterly unchanged. Her stride was efficient, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. She didn't gasp or groan. She simply consumed the miles, her expression a blank mask of concentration. The platoon saw a robot. They didn't see the years of brutal, solitary training that had turned her body into a finely calibrated engine, designed for one purpose: to keep going when everyone else had stopped. One afternoon, sitting on her footlocker, she performed a ritual that drew silent mockery from Miller's corner of the barracks. She had her boots, socks, and foot care kit laid out on a clean towel. With surgical precision, she inspected every inch of her boots, checking the stitching, working the leather with a light coat of conditioner. She examined her feet, filing down a callus, applying a special balm. It was a slow, deliberate process that took nearly an hour. Davis snickered. What's she doing? Giving her boots a spa day. Miller grunted. She's probably never had a blister in her life. Probably never done a real hump. Sharma heard them. She registered the words as background noise, like the hum of the barracks ventilation system. They couldn't understand. To them, boots were just footwear. To her, they were the foundation of everything. They were the difference between being an asset and being a liability. In her previous life, her feet had carried her over mountains, through deserts, and across landscapes so hostile they felt like another planet. She had learned, the hard way, that a mission's success or failure could hinge on a single, festering blister. Her care wasn't obsession, it was survival. It was a silent testament to a life they couldn't possibly imagine, a foreshadowing of a trial they were about to unwittingly create for her. The pressure began to build on a Tuesday morning, under the oppressive humidity of a North Carolina summer. The platoon was gathered in a loose formation on the company street. The air was thick and still, promising a day of sweltering heat. Gunny Reyes stood before them, his arms crossed, his face set in stone. "Listen up," he barked, and the low chatter immediately died. "In 72 hours, this battalion will be conducting a forced march. For those of you new to the unit, we call it the Reaper." A collective groan rippled through the ranks, a mix of genuine dread and performative toughness. The Reaper was a legend within the battalion, a 25-mile gut check over the most punishing terrain the base had to offer. It wasn't just a march. It was a ritual of suffering. Full combat load, 60 pounds of gear, plus weapon and water. Up steep, rock-strewn inclines through swamps and across open, sun-baked fields. The time limit was unforgiving. Falling out was not an option. It was a mark of shame that would follow a Marine for the rest of his time in the unit. "This is not a suggestion," Gunny Reyes continued, his eyes scanning every face. "This is a non-negotiable event. It is a baseline requirement for deployment. You will be weighed before and after. You will carry the prescribed load. You will finish, or you will find yourself on the next bus to a non-deployable unit. Is that understood?" Gunny!" the platoon shouted in unison. The announcement sent a charge of nervous energy through the company. In the barracks that evening, the air was thick with it. Marines were meticulously prepping their gear, a flurry of anxious activity. Miller and his crew were the loudest, their boasts echoing through the squad bay. 25 miles? That's a light jog," Miller declared, strapping a new pouch to his vest. "I'll be at the finish line drinking a beer before half you boots even hit the halfway point." Davis and Sanchez laughed, their own anxieties hidden behind a veneer of reflected confidence. They were all talking, checking and rechecking their gear, debating the merits of different sock combinations, a loud symphony of preemptive excuses and empty boasts. Amidst the chaos, Sharma was an island of calm. She sat on her rack, her equipment already laid out, already prepped. There was no wasted motion, no second-guessing. Her pack was balanced with the precision of a watchmaker. Her hydration bladder was filled. Her spare socks were rolled and stowed in a waterproof bag. Her boots, already perfectly broken in and cared for, sat beneath her rack, ready. Her tranquility was a profound irritant to Miller. He saw it as arrogance, as a silent judgment on their own frantic preparations. She wasn't participating in their ritual of shared anxiety, and her exclusion felt like a statement. "Something funny, Sharma?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Sharma looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting his. She didn't respond immediately, just held his gaze. "No, Corporal," she said finally. "There's nothing funny about a 25-mile march." Her placid response was more infuriating than defiance. She wasn't playing their game. She was operating on a different level, one they didn't understand and therefore resented. The pressure of the impending march was mounting, but a different, more personal pressure was building around Sergeant Sharma. Miller looked at her, then at her perfectly prepared gear, and finally at the boots tucked neatly under her rack. A mean, desperate idea began to form in the back of his mind. If she wouldn't break, maybe he could break something of hers. The world was still dark and silent when the barracks lights flickered on at 0300. The sharp command to get up and get ready cut through the groggy air. It was the morning of the Reaper. A wave of motion swept through the squad bay as Marines rolled out of their racks, the sounds of rustling gear and quiet curses filling the space. Anya Sharma swung her legs over the side of her cot, her movements already awake and precise. She reached down for her boots, the solid, dependable leather she had spent weeks molding to her feet. Her hand met empty air. She paused, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth concrete. She looked again, her eyes tracing the clean space beneath her rack. They were gone. Her perfectly maintained, perfectly broken-in boots had vanished. For a single, fleeting moment, a spark of pure, cold fury ignited deep within her. It was an old, familiar feeling, a ghost from a past life she kept ruthlessly suppressed. It wasn't the anger of a victim. It was the predatory rage of an apex survivor whose tools had been stolen. She extinguished it as quickly as it came. Anger was a luxury. It wasted energy and clouded judgment. She didn't get up and search. She didn't raise her voice or wake her squad leader to file a complaint. Accusations were pointless and would only mark her as a complainer, a problem. That was what the thieves wanted. They wanted to see her panic, to watch her fail before the test even began. She would give them nothing. Her eyes scanned the room, a quick, darting assessment. She saw Miller, already dressed, pointedly not looking in her direction. She saw the ghost of a smirk on Davis's face as he bent to tie his own laces. The data was collected, the conclusion obvious. She had approximately 10 minutes until first formation. She stood and moved to her footlocker. Her hands worked with a calm, methodical efficiency that defied the situation. She pulled out 2 pairs of the thickest wool socks she owned. Then, she retrieved a roll of wide, olive-drab medical tape. This was her intervention. It wasn't the one they expected. Sitting on the edge of her rack, she began to work. She put on the first pair of socks. Then she started wrapping. She taped her feet with an expert's touch, creating a layered, protective shell. She started at the ball of her foot, moved around the heel, supported the arch, and then encased the entire foot in a tight, overlapping weave. It was a technique she hadn't used in years, a field-expedient solution learned from a Pashtun guide in the Hindu Kush, a man who could run for days over razor-sharp shale. She wasn't just covering her skin. She was creating a new sole, a crude but functional barrier against the miles ahead. She pulled the second pair of socks over the taped layers. It felt bulky and strange, a poor substitute for the solid leather and Vibram rubber of her boots. She stood up, testing her weight. It would have to do. She shouldered her pack, grabbed her rifle, and walked out of the barracks, falling into her spot in the pre-dawn darkness of the formation just as Gunny Reyes bellowed. "Fall in." Miller, standing a few ranks ahead, glanced back. He expected to see her arguing with a sergeant, or perhaps not there at all. Instead, he saw her standing at perfect attention, her face a calm mask in the dim light. He couldn't see her feet, hidden in the shadows and the loose fit of her trousers. But he knew her boots were gone. He smirked to himself, confident that she would be on the casualty bus before they even cleared the base perimeter. He had set a trap, and he was sure she had just walked right into it. The march began as a low rumble, the sound of 500 pairs of boots striking asphalt in unison. The column of Marines moved like a great green serpent through the sleeping base, their silhouettes stark against the first pale light of dawn. For the first 3 miles, the pavement was forgiving. The pain in Sharma's feet was a dull, rhythmic throb, a baseline of discomfort she could manage. She focused on her breathing, on the cadence of the march, on the weight of the pack settling onto the frame of her hips. She was a machine built for this, and she was simply letting the engine run. As the sun climbed, they left the paved roads behind, turning onto a gravel service track that led into the training grounds. With each step, sharp stones and jagged pebbles dug into the thin layers of tape and wool on her feet. The dull throb sharpened into a series of stinging, insistent bites. She didn't wince or alter her stride. Her face remained a mask of placid concentration. Pain was just another form of data, a signal from her body that required analysis, not emotion. She adjusted her footfalls, learning to land on the flatter parts of the ground, reading the terrain 10 feet ahead of her like a map. Gunny Reyes was in a Humvee, patrolling the length of the column. It was his job to spot the stragglers, the ones whose will was beginning to crack. As he drove slowly past Bravo Company, his eyes fell on Sergeant Sharma. He noticed something odd about her gait, a subtle stiffness that wasn't there during their platoon runs. He slowed the vehicle, his gaze narrowing. At first, he couldn't place it. Then he saw it, under the cuff of her trousers, where the dark, polished leather of a standard-issue boot should be. There was only the lumpy, olive-drab shape of a sock. He swore under his breath. He thought she was a fool, an officer-pleasing sergeant so desperate to avoid trouble that she'd rather march without boots than report them stolen. He was angry at her for her stupidity, and at the Marines he knew were responsible. He made a mental note to tear Bravo Company apart when this was over. He expected to see her waving for the follow-on vehicle within the next mile. But she didn't wave. The whispers started around mile 5, as they began the first real incline. A Marine marching behind her noticed it first. "Holy hell," he muttered to the man next to him. Is she Barefoot?" The word spread through the ranks like a virus. Heads turned, eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't some act of protest or foolish pride. This was something else entirely. She was still in the middle of the formation, her pace steady, her rifle held at the proper angle, her posture straighter than that of the men around her who were already starting to slump under the weight of their packs. Corporal Miller heard the whispers. He looked back, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He saw her, still there, still moving. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to quit. She was supposed to fail, to prove him right. Instead, she was enduring an agony he couldn't even comprehend, and she was doing it without a single complaint. The Marines around him weren't snickering anymore. They were watching her with a new, strange expression, a mixture of pity, confusion, and a dawning, grudging awe. The prank had been meant to expose her as weak. Instead, it was starting to reveal a strength they had never imagined. Miller's certainty began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping shame. By mile 12, the Reaper March was earning its name. The route had veered off the gravel track and onto a narrow, winding trail that clawed its way up a series of steep, wooded hills. The ground was a treacherous mix of loose rock, slippery clay, and grasping roots. The sun was high now, a merciless white disk in the sky, and the humidity was like a wet blanket, smothering the air and soaking their uniforms with sweat. The platoon's initial cohesion had fractured. Gaps were forming in the column as stronger Marines pushed ahead and others began to falter. The boasting of the morning had evaporated, replaced by the grim, internal calculus of pain and endurance. This was the second test. It wasn't enough to simply endure the march. The Reaper was designed to break you when you're already hurting. And no one was hurting more than Sergeant Sharma. Every step was a fresh agony. The crude protection she had fashioned for her feet was failing. The tape was bunching and tearing, and the socks were shredded. She could feel hot blisters forming, then rupturing, the raw skin grinding against the coarse fabric and embedded grit. The pain was a white-hot fire, but she had walled it off in her mind. It was there, she acknowledged it, but she refused to give it control. She focused on the mission, one foot in front of the other. Reach the objective. They reached the part of the trail known as the Devil's Staircase, a brutal, half-mile ascent over a field of shattered rock and scree. It was less a path and more a controlled climb. Marines, top-heavy with their packs, stumbled and slid, their lungs burning. The air filled with curses and the clatter of dislodged stones. It was here that PFC Sanchez, one of Miller's own, finally hit his limit. His foot slipped on a loose rock, and he went down hard, his ankle twisting with an audible pop of cartilage. A cry of pain escaped his lips. He tried to get up, but his leg wouldn't take the weight. He was done. The Marines around him hesitated, their own exhaustion making them reluctant to stop. Falling behind meant a harder climb to catch up. As Sanchez began to despair, a figure stepped out of the line and moved toward him. It was Sharma. She didn't say a word. She knelt beside him, her face unreadable. Her eyes assessed his ankle, then looked up at his pale, sweating face. "Get up, Marine," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through his pain. "I can't, Sergeant. My ankle's gone." "Your ankle is sprained." "It is not gone," she corrected him calmly. "You can still walk on it. It will hurt. That is all." She grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. Before he could protest, she had shifted her position, placing her shoulder under his, taking a significant portion of his weight and the weight of his pack. "We are moving," she stated. And they moved. Sharma, on feet that were now a mangled pulp of raw flesh, half-carried a Marine who outweighed her by 30 pounds up the steepest, most difficult section of the entire march. She didn't grunt or strain. Her breathing deepened, but it remained controlled. She set a slow, steady, unbreakable rhythm, forcing Sanchez to match it. From 20 yards ahead, Miller watched the scene unfold. He had stopped, turning back to see what the commotion was. He saw Sharma, her face pale but set like flint, bearing the weight of the man he was supposed to be leading. He saw her grit her teeth with every excruciating step on the sharp rocks, her own agony subjugated to the needs of another Marine. The last vestiges of his arrogance and contempt dissolved into a profound and burning shame. He had tried to break her with a childish, cruel prank, and in response, she was demonstrating the very essence of the Corps' ethos: never leave a Marine behind. He had tried to prove she didn't belong, and she was showing him that she might be the only one who truly understood what it meant to be a Marine. High above the Devil's Staircase, on a rocky overlook that gave him a clear view of the struggling column, Gunnery Sergeant Reyes watched through a pair of powerful binoculars. He had been tracking Sharma for the last hour, his initial anger evolving into a state of professional disbelief. He had seen Marines push through incredible pain, but this was different. This wasn't just grit. It was a form of practiced, deliberate transcendence. She wasn't fighting the pain. She was managing it, compartmentalizing it, using it as fuel. He focused the binoculars on her as she helped Sanchez up the incline. He watched her movements, the precise way she distributed their combined weight, the way she placed her torn and bloody feet to maintain balance on the treacherous scree. Her technique was flawless. It was the movement of someone who had spent a lifetime walking on broken ground. It wasn't the clumsy stagger of an infantryman. It was the fluid, predatory grace of a tracker. And then he saw it. As she shifted her weight, the cuff of her trouser leg rode up, exposing the shredded socks and the layers of tape beneath. He saw the distinct, cross-hatch pattern she had used to support her arch and ankle. It wasn't a random wrapping. It was a system, a specific unorthodox technique he had seen only once before, years ago, in a pre-mission brief for a joint special operations task force in Afghanistan. It was a method taught to a very small, very select group of operatives who specialized in long-range reconnaissance and tracking in mountainous terrain. A memory, hazy and half-forgotten, clicked into place. Whispers from a Green Beret ODA team he had supported. Stories of a shadow operative attached to their unit. Someone who moved through the mountains of the Helmand province like a ghost. They never used a name, only a call sign. Kala, the Hindi word for blackness, or the embodiment of time and death. The legends around Kala were mythical. They said Kala once tracked a high-value target for 3 days and 70 miles on foot across the spine of the Tora Bora, alone, after their insertion vehicle was destroyed. They said Kala could move without a sound and endure things that would kill a normal man. No one ever said if Kala was a man or a woman. The operative was just a phantom, a whisper of impossible competence. Reyes lowered his binoculars, a cold realization washing over him. The heavily redacted file, the unnatural calm and discipline, the inhuman pain tolerance, the specialized foot taping technique. It couldn't be. A legendary MARSOC raider, a Tier 1 operator, assigned to a regular infantry battalion as a sergeant? It made no sense. And yet, watching her down below, moving with that unbreakable will, it was the only thing that did. He looked at the suffering Marine on the trail and didn't see Sergeant Sharma anymore. He saw the ghost from the stories. He saw Kala, and he understood that Colonel Madsen hadn't been sent a problem. He had been sent a weapon of incomprehensible value, and they had all been too blind to see it. The finish line was an arbitrary chalk stripe across a dirt road, flanked by a few Humvees and a medical tent. It marked the end of 25 miles of hell. The platoon staggered across it in ones and twos, a depleted column of exhausted, sweat-soaked survivors. Their faces were gray with fatigue, their movements stiff and clumsy. Some dropped to their knees the moment they crossed the line. Sergeant Sharma crossed the line not with the first group, but in the first third. She had stayed with Sanchez to the end, her presence a silent, steadying force that had pulled him through the final, agonizing miles. Once they were safely across, she released him to the waiting corpsman. The moment her mission was complete, the moment she was no longer responsible for another Marine, the iron wall of her control finally allowed a single crack. Her legs, which had functioned like pistons for 8 straight hours, simply gave out. She didn't fall dramatically. She folded, lowering herself to the ground with the last ounce of her strength, her back coming to rest against the wheel of a Humvee. She sat there, her head bowed, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. She had finished. That was all that mattered. A corpsman rushed to her side, his medical bag open. "Sergeant, let me see your feet." She looked up, her eyes clouded with pain, but still sharp. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Not yet. She needed a moment to bring the pain back inside the walls, to reassert control. It was then that 3 figures approached, their shadows falling over her. It was Corporal Miller, with Davis and Sanchez beside him. Sanchez was leaning on Davis, his ankle already being iced, but his face was a mask of profound gratitude. Miller's face was stripped of all its previous arrogance. It was pale, drawn, and etched with a shame so deep it was painful to look at. He didn't speak. He knelt in front of her. In his hands, he held her boots. They were clean, the leather conditioned, the laces perfectly tied. He must have gone back to the barracks and cleaned them while the company was in morning formation. He set them down on the ground in front of her, a silent, humble offering. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. His own were fixed on the shredded, bloody mess of her feet. "Sergeant," he finally managed to say, his voice thick and cracking. It was the only word he could find. It was an apology, a confession, and a mark of respect, all in one. A second shadow fell over the group. Colonel Madsen stood there, Gunny Reyes at his side. The gunny had obviously briefed him. Madsen's face, usually a mask of stern skepticism, was unreadable. He looked from Miller's bowed head to Sharma's ravaged feet. He saw the offered boots. He saw the quiet dignity in Sharma's posture, even as she sat exhausted and in agony on the ground. He saw the entire story without a single word being spoken. He took a step forward, stopping directly in front of her. Sharma looked up, her gaze meeting his. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say a word of praise or apology. He simply came to the sharpest, most rigid position of attention she had ever seen. He raised his hand to his brow and delivered a salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture an officer gives a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, unequivocal respect. A salute from one warrior to another. The aid station was an oasis of sterile quiet after the chaotic noise of the finish line. The air smelled of antiseptic and clean linen. Most of the other Marines who needed treatment had already been patched up and sent on their way, nursing cramps, dehydration, and minor injuries. Sharma was alone in a corner, sitting on the edge of a cot. A young Navy corpsman had approached her, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe at the sight of her feet. "Let me take care of that for you, Sergeant," he had said, his voice gentle. Sharma had looked from his face to his hands, and then back. She gave him a small, polite nod of acknowledgement, but then reached for the medical kit herself. She would do this. It was her ritual, her process of reclaiming her body from the ordeal it had endured. The corpseman understood. He left the supplies on the table beside her and retreated, giving her the space she needed. With the same methodical precision she used to clean her rifle, she began to clean her feet. She unwrapped the layers of tape, which now clung to her skin with a glue of dried blood and sweat. She worked slowly, patiently, her face betraying no emotion as she exposed the raw, blistered flesh beneath. She irrigated the wounds, picked out the embedded pieces of gravel with a pair of sterilized tweezers, and gently patted the skin dry. It was an act of meticulous self-repair, a physical manifestation of her internal discipline. She was resetting her foundation. On the table, next to the medical supplies, sat her boots. They were perfectly clean, a stark contrast to the bloody rags of her socks in the bin beside her. Miller had done more than just wipe them down. He had restored them. They were an icon of his shame and his newfound respect. They were no longer a tool of harassment, but a symbol of her victory, an acknowledgement she had never asked for but had unequivocally earned. When she finished cleaning and dressing her wounds, wrapping them in clean white bandages, she didn't put the boots on. Her feet were too swollen, too damaged. Instead, she just sat there in the quiet hum of the medical tent, looking at them. The march was over. The test was passed. She hadn't said a word of complaint, had never sought pity or demanded justice. She had simply taken the obstacle they had thrown in her path and used it as another tool to complete the mission. Her dignity remained perfectly intact, forged even stronger in the crucible of their contempt. The silence in the room was absolute, filled only by her quiet strength. She had arrived as a problem the colonel didn't want and a threat the platoon resented. She was still a sergeant in Bravo Company, but now she was something more. She was a standard, and her legend, like the Reaper March itself, would be told not in loud boasts, but in quiet, awestruck whispers for years to come.